Let's be blunt, shall we? Eurovision 2024 was a shit show, a train wreck of a show whose every misstep can be traced back to the one decision to let a regime currently engaged in a genocide participate against all common sense and humanity. Chaos surrounded the event. For example, there were mass protests in Malmö against Israel's participation. Sweden's treasurer Greta Thunberg was there, of course, because she's awesome. Sweden brought in additional police from Denmark and Norway and turned Malmö into a miniature police state to handle the growing unrest. This despite pro-Palestinian protests being markedly and consistently peaceful events, bar escalations by the police or outside pro-Israel agitators. Pro-Palestine graffiti was accidentally removed from a legal graffiti wall by Malmö's local government, who apologized for this supposed oopsie. Basically, the authorities tried to sanitize and depoliticize an inherently insanitary and political situation. Unsuccessfully, fortunately, because despite their best efforts, news reporting surrounding Eurovision was framed by the opposition to the genocide in Gaza. The scale of the death and destruction taking place there is just too big and too horrible to cover up and ignore. Chaos didn't just surround the event, but was also part of the event. The European Broadcasting Union, the EBU, reportedly added fake cheers and used AI to remove boos during Israel's performances in an attempt to whitewash and sanitize the show. The EBU ignored and made excuses while the Israeli delegation harassed participants, but immediately disqualified the Dutch artist Joost Klein on shaky grounds, not long after he had a tense interaction with Israel's Eden Golan, where he interjected to ask why she didn't have to answer a question about safety concerns caused by her presence. Then, something, he had threatened a photographer apparently, and he's gone. Just like that. Whatever happened, the EBU had no problem acting quickly and with authority to disqualify him, but they have at every turn chosen to extend miles of leeway to Israel, ignoring harassment of other contestants by the Israeli delegation, ignoring clear rule violations by the Israeli broadcaster Khan, and, of course, pretending that Israel wasn't murdering scores of human beings at the precise time that the show, whose motto is United by Music, went live. That's a summary of some of the highlights, I suppose, of this year's Eurovision. But there are three topics I want to talk about specifically in more detail. Namely, the claim that Eurovision is apolitical, the voting results we saw in the grand final, and where we go from here with the fundamentally poisoned legacy the EBU has now created. So let's start with the first topic. Over and over and over again, year in and year out, but especially this year, the EBU has beaten us over the head with the dubious claim that Eurovision is apolitical, whatever that actually means. This at the same time as Eurovision's stated goal is to be united by music, a statement that is itself undoubtedly political. So let's talk a little bit about how apolitical Eurovision has actually been. And you can't do that without talking about Israel. Israel is currently engaged in a genocide. There is no other word to describe the horror that Israel has unleashed on innocent Palestinians in Gaza. It is a concerted effort to cause as much death and suffering as possible. The use of white phosphorus, indiscriminate bombing of population centers, targeted destruction of hospitals, targeted killings of journalists and aid workers, the blocking of humanitarian aid, systematic imprisonment and torture of innocent civilians in concentration camps, including children who have been sexually assaulted. And all this wrapped up in a neat bow of clear and conscious genocidal intent, incitement, and fervor, by Israeli officials and media. Israel's onslaught in Gaza is truly one of the greatest evils of our time, and it's happening now after 75 years of old-school colonialism and apartheid. It is just absolutely unconscionable. In this context, the EBU made the choice to let Israel compete in Eurovision, a music competition meant to unite the world. This is itself a political action. The EBU has, of course, framed this as not really taking a side, not bringing the politics into it. But to not take a side at this very moment in history is to take a side. There was a poignant post on Twitter that included the news of horrible Israeli concentration camps, and the caption that, quote, "If y'all have ever wondered what you would have done during the Holocaust, you're doing it right now," end quote. That's exactly right, and the EBU let the genocidal regime participate in the spirit of unity, at the expense of everyone else, especially at the expense of the Palestinians whose blood is being washed away by Eurovision's normalization of Israel. There is the obvious hypocrisy we can point to, namely that Russia was rightfully banned from participating after illegally invading Ukraine. Choosing not to ban Israel at a time when they're murdering tens of thousands of children and starving to death millions more suggests only one thing, which is the complete and utter disregard for Palestinians as full and equal human beings. It's literally just racism. The EBU used the excuse that it's not a competition between governments but between countries' respective television broadcasters, and they claim that Israel's television broadcaster, Khan, hasn't broken any of Eurovision's rules. Respectfully, no, actually, not the least bit respectfully, this is a load of horseshit in a number of ways. First of all, you can't separate a country's government body from its national broadcaster. That doesn't actually make any sense, and literally nobody thinks like that. Did you ever think, oh, this year Israel's national broadcaster is competing? Absurd. It especially doesn't make any sense when Israeli media has consistently, since the start of Israel's genocide in Gaza, made itself guilty of incitement to commit genocide. Israeli media has dehumanized Palestinians, calling them monsters and claiming all of them, including all the children, are collectively guilty for the crimes of Hamas, all while downplaying Israeli crimes against Palestinians the last 75 years. Israeli media has called for genocidal violence to be used against Palestinians. But that's an inconvenient truth. It is inconvenient for the EBU to acknowledge this, because they want to pretend there's a wall between the Israeli government apparatus and the Israeli media apparatus. There really isn't. There wasn't one between the Kremlin and Russian state media, and there isn't one between the Knesset and Israeli state media. Not even the EBU believes this excuse. Not really. When Russia was banned from competing in Eurovision, the EBU referenced, quote, "the unprecedented crisis in Ukraine," end quote, but made no mention of Russian state media breaking any rules. Instead, the concern was that, quote, "the inclusion of a Russian entry would bring the competition into disrepute," end quote. I agree with that reasoning. Genocidal and warmongering regimes like Russia and like Israel shouldn't be normalized in the spirit of coming together. Yet this concern wasn't present with the inclusion of an Israeli entry this year, even after so many Palestinians have been brutally murdered. I don't necessarily think pointing to hypocrisy is a good argument on its own, but it is quite damning when moral clarity was so perfectly present when white Europeans were victimized by Russia, but not when brown Arabs are victimized by Israel. This points to a bias, a racist bias that shows just how dehumanized Palestinians are. This hypocrisy is not just hypocrisy, but a rejection of Palestinians as full and equal human beings. And this has certainly brought the competition into disrepute, all because of choices made and attitudes held by the EBU. Second of all, Israeli media did explicitly break Eurovision rules consistently, including commentary during the first semi-final about Ireland's Bambi Thug being a Satanist who hates Israel, classic poisoning of the well, and certainly political. The Israeli delegation also harassed several other contestants, especially anyone who'd been even mildly critical of Israel's genocide. The EBU chose to turn a blind eye to this at every turn, only ever acknowledging that Israel even had broken rules when forced to do so by mounting public pressure and contestants demanding they take action. And what action did they take? None. Nada. Nothing. Zero. Zip. Zilch. The EBU did absolutely fuck all. Again, if people are being harassed by the delegation of a genocidal regime and you do nothing, that is in itself an action and a statement. That is taking a side. Because, and here's the crucial point, there is no such thing as apolitical. That's an idealized fantasy, not a real thing. Because everything is political. The choices we make or don't make shape the world around us, inevitably, unavoidably, whether we like it or not. Not making a choice is making a choice. Not taking a side is taking a side. Especially when one side is so obviously and egregiously wrong. Eurovision is and always has been political. It's stood for inclusiveness, tolerance, and multiculturalism. It's stood for LGBTQ people and the right to be who you are. The EBU is even promoting how this year's winner, Nemo, is the first non-binary person to win Eurovision. How is that not political? It obviously is. Especially in this climate where the far-right is whipping up a full-blown moral panic about the existence of trans and non-binary people. Nothing can ever be apolitical as long as the existence of certain demographics of people is treated as political by some political factions. Currently, there are political factions that want to erase gay people, trans people, and non-binary people. There are political factions that want to erase brown and black people. And there is certainly a faction that wants to erase Palestinians. And the EBU helped them do so this year by, in a one-sided manner, allowing Israel to compete while banning Palestinian symbols for being too controversial, thereby erasing an entire ethnic group from existence, just because acknowledging their existence would be to acknowledge the evil genocide that they're currently suffering. Erik Saade, a Swedish artist whose father is Palestinian, chose to wear a Palestinian keffiyeh on stage during the first semi-final, and the EBU as well as Sweden's public television broadcaster, SVT, criticized him for it. He shot back with a great response, saying his father gave him the Palestinian keffiyeh as a reminder of where they're from. He continued that he didn't know at the time that it would one day be called a political symbol, and that this is just racism. He concluded that the EBU seems to find his ethnicity controversial, which says nothing about him but everything about them. He is precisely right. The EBU has, through the choices made during this year's Eurovision, accepted the logic of bigotry and made the existence of Palestinians themselves political, in the exact same way that the far right has made the existence of LGBTQ people political. So what it comes down to is not whether Eurovision should be political or not, but rather in what way it should be political. Inclusiveness, tolerance, and multiculturalism are no-brainers, in my mind, but peace, anti-apartheid, and anti-genocide should also be absolute no-brainers. As a concluding point and a segue to the next segment of the video, with the inclusion of Israel in the competition, this year was never going to be apolitical, because Israel has a vested interest in spreading propaganda that helps them go through with the genocide. Being normalized by being allowed to participate in Eurovision is part of that propaganda. And the people who are opposed to genocide were never going to let that happen without resistance. And the people who support Israel, primarily the far right, weren't going to let that resistance happen without counter resistance. By including Israel this year, the EBU turned Eurovision into a culture war battleground that the far right could use to push narratives and propaganda. So, with that said, let's talk about the voting results. Before the grand final even aired, I feared that Israel would win, and I had a few reasons for believing this. That feeling didn't let up when Italy leaked its voting results, revealing that the Israeli entry got an insane 40% of the vote. This put Israel at the top of the betting lists ahead of the big night. With the benefit of hindsight, it didn't quite turn out that way. Instead, Switzerland won a well-deserved victory with Nemo, a fantastic artist with a fantastic song and performance. I liked their quite political song about their journey toward learning that they're actually non-binary. It's good stuff. Although it was mildly amusing that Keria lost because of the jury last year despite winning the popular vote, and this time the Keria-inspired Baby Lasagna from Croatia also lost because of the jury despite winning the popular vote. I can't believe Keria actually lost twice in the exact same way. All kidding aside, I think Keria's Cha 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 was the clear winner last year, whereas both Nemo and Baby Lasagna were fantastic this year. Ireland's Bambi Thug was also great, and I respect their solidarity with Palestine. At any rate, Israel also did quite well with the popular vote, receiving 323 points, including the majority of the 12-pointers from the audience. Pro-Israel agitators have used this to try to undermine the obvious public displays of solidarity with Palestinians we've seen by protesters gathering outside and the audience loudly booing Israel at every turn. They do so by claiming that the voting results clearly show that there is a silent majority of people who support Israel. Setting aside the obvious fascist rhetoric of a silent majority, is there actually any merit to this? It's hard to say, but I'm inclined to say no, not really, and I'll explain why. Israel's entry this year worked as a lightning rod for Zionists and other fascists to publicly display their support for Israel, and by extension, the genocide in Gaza. The State of Israel organized voting with advertisements and by contacting Jewish diaspora around the world directly, urging them to vote for Israel. But we're not going to pretend that this is a Jewish problem, because it isn't. So many Jewish people, including Holocaust survivors, have spoken out against Israel's genocidal politics. It is an anti-Semitic trope to equate the State of Israel with Jewish people. It is an anti-Semitic trope to equate Judaism and Jewishness with Zionism, because Zionism isn't the same as either. No, Zionism is a fascist ideology that wraps itself in the aesthetics of Jewishness, in the same way that Nazism is a fascist ideology that wraps itself in the aesthetics of whiteness. At any rate, I would say that the majority of the vote for Israel likely came predominantly from non-Jewish fascists who have a vested political interest in elevating Israel, for a number of reasons I won't go into too much here because the video is getting to be pretty long. But in short, a few reasons are Islamophobia, obviously, strong historic support for Israel as a vital part of the American empire, idealization of Israel as a model for an ethno-state, and the Christo-fascist belief that the end times, Armageddon, can only happen while Israel is under Jewish control. For many on the far right who subscribe to an inherently irrational ideology, support for Israel is just about contrarianism. Exactly why the right supports Israel despite obvious human rights abuses and genocide is not important right now anyway, just a fact that's vital to understand the results. Many far-right politicians in Europe have publicly asked their supporters to vote for Israel, preferably up to the full 20 times allowed per phone number. And many right-wing agitators did exactly as told and voted the full 20 times they were allowed, sometimes 40, 60, 80, or 100 times, using multiple phones and credit cards. You know, loser behavior. I've seen people proudly puff out their chests and proclaim that the people in Europe actually love Israel, and that's why they voted for Israel over 20 times. In the same breath, claiming that there's overwhelming support for Israel and disproving their own claim by illustrating just why Israel's points were massively inflated. They've deluded themselves into believing that the results are an accurate representation of popular opinion somehow, despite by their own admission voting 20 times, 40 times, 60 times, or more. Meanwhile, many who are anti-genocide boycotted Eurovision and didn't even vote. If they did vote, there wasn't an anti-Zionist lightning rod to focus those votes on. People who aren't pro-Israel spread their votes across 24 different entries, whereas people who are pro-Israel supported their one entry with as many votes as they were allowed to cast, sometimes more. This, to me, strongly suggests that the public support for Israel as seen in the voting results is an illusion, especially as most people who aren't rabidly pro-Israel probably did not vote the full 20 times, because they're not losers. We also need to understand how the points actually work. Getting the most points suggests getting most votes, but the voting system is quite counterintuitive. Just like the international juries, each country has different set points to hand out: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, and 12. This means only the top 10 out of 25 get any points at all, for one, and it means that the difference in votes between the entries doesn't need to be very significant at all. You see, to get a country's 12-pointer, you just need to have the highest number of votes out of all 25 entries, even if the difference is just a single vote. To illustrate what I mean, let's do a thought experiment. Assume that all entries get the same number of votes. That would mean each entry gets 4%. Okay, now for one of those 25 entries to get the 12-pointer, they would only need one additional vote in this scenario. In other words, it is hypothetically possible to get the highest points with just 4.000001% of the vote. Do I think that's what happened? No, probably not. But I find it highly unlikely that Israel got an actual majority of the vote, or anywhere near. And what they did get, they got after loads of people abstained from voting because Israel was allowed to compete, and right-wing agitators organized voting for Israel the full 20 times they were allowed. Whatever percentage of votes Israel received, it undoubtedly received a much lower percentage of voters. Given all this, Israel's high result is not unexpected. In fact, before the show, I thought they'd do far better for exactly all the reasons I laid out here. In a country like Sweden, with 10 million people, it wouldn't take a lot of cringe reactionaries pathetically voting for Israel 20 times to skew the results. Eurovision is popular here, so maybe 2.5 million people watched. Probably fewer, but I haven't seen the numbers yet. If those people voted at least once, let's say twice on average, that's 5 million votes, spread across 25 contestants. That's an average of 200,000 votes per song. Now let's say just 10,000 weird fascists, i.e. 0.1% of the population, used all 20 of their votes on Israel to signal support. That's 200,000 votes, easily enough to skew the results significantly, with just 0.1% of the population. If instead of 0.1%, just 1% did this, in other words, 100,000 people, that would be 2 million votes for Israel. What I'm saying is, it really is not very hard to imagine a scenario in which Israel won the popular vote by a landslide because of a small minority of voters, specifically obsessed reactionary losers. After the results were published in Sweden, numerous articles have popped up writing about how the people in Sweden voted for Israel with absolutely none of the context I just provided. Not just right-wing blogs, but reputable news outlets just uncritically reporting on the results and how the Swedish people voted for Israel, without a hint of context or explanation. Right-wing politicians who have been loudly calling for everyone to vote for Israel celebrated that Israel won the people's vote and were met with warm replies from right-wing losers saying they voted 40 times by means of 2 phones, seemingly without any realization that they're unintentionally revealing exactly what I've been saying here, that a minority of reactionary losers skew the results, and that the results of the vote aren't necessarily as indicative of popular support for Israel as they would like to pretend. Ironically, it's possible that the more pro-Palestine a country is, the easier it is for a minority of far-right agitators to win the vote by spamming 20 votes each. Ireland, for example, one of the most pro-Palestine countries in the world, in large part because of its history of being victimized by the British Empire and the understanding and solidarity gained through those experiences, gave Israel a 10. Some would point to this and say that the Irish public has a silent majority that is actually pro-Israel. But think about it. The more pro-Palestine you are, the less likely you were to vote in and support Eurovision this year, leaving the bar the fascists needed to clear in order to win much lower. As I've explained, it would be enough that a small minority of people voted 20 times with intentionality for Israel for the results to be massively skewed. So don't look at the results and lose hope. These results are meaningless without access to more information, such as total number of votes and average number of votes from the same phone number for each contestant. I promise you, Israel's average number of votes from the same phone number was significantly higher than for any other country. Honorable mentions go to Ukraine and Croatia, which were the only countries to give Israel 0 points. I don't know enough about the politics of Croatia to comment as to why, but why this is the case for Ukraine is actually rather obvious. You see, Israel's contestant, Eden Golan, is, in addition to being Israeli, also Russian. And she is, in addition to being pro-Israel, also pro-Russian. There is a Ukrainian-run website called Peacemaker, which keeps track of what it deems to be enemies of Ukraine. This website has a page on Eden and claims she has participated in anti-Ukrainian propaganda activities and performed in occupied Crimea. So it's pretty obvious why Ukrainians don't like her. Even the Ukrainian far-right wouldn't support her like the far-right elsewhere did, because the Ukrainian far-right is in a rather unique position where its political goals run contrary to the political goals of other fascists. Mainly because international fascists tend to support Russia and Ukrainian fascists don't. Because of the whole invasion thing. For further evidence that the support for Israel was entirely manufactured by a small subset of weirdos, let's look at this tweet by Eurovision Charts. As you can see, despite getting the second most votes, Israel's song is nowhere to be seen in this list of the 9 most streamed songs on Spotify on May 11th, which does in fact suggest that the voting results were artificially inflated by a small minority of pro-Israel activists, if you can call them that. So, yeah. To close this episode, I want to talk about the future of Eurovision and the legacy the EBU just created for itself after this year's shit show. The fascists who mass voted for Israel won't stick around. They don't care about Eurovision. In fact, they hate it because they hate its politics, ironically. They hate its respect and love for LGBTQ people and LGBTQ culture. They hate its feminism and respect for women. They hate everything about it because it's woke. But because of the EBU's atrocious decision-making, this particular year they could use it as a vehicle for their hateful Islamophobic pro-genocide politics. And this has completely and utterly broken Eurovision. How could it not? How does Eurovision move forward with any kind of integrity and moral authority after the year that it bent itself out of shape to include a state engaged in genocide and exclude those who oppose genocide? Any perceived moral high ground that was previously held by our free, democratic, and inclusive Western institutions, including the EBU and Eurovision, has been completely wiped away by the pervasively implicit and oftentimes explicit support for Israel and its supposed right to defend itself against the scores of children it is currently murdering. I want to go back to the tweet I quoted before because it was so well put. If you've ever wondered what you would have done during the Holocaust, you're doing it now. It is that bad. Israel's genocidal actions toward Palestinians are that bad. This is what the EBU let into Eurovision this year. Basically, any goodwill people previously felt for the EBU has completely evaporated. So many people are angry and disappointed with Israel's inclusion, Just's rushed disqualification, the toxic environment backstage, and the silencing of people's voices when they tried to show their dissatisfaction with Israel by bringing Palestinian flags or booing Israel's entry. These decisions appear to have been made to appease Israel and Eurovision's major Israeli sponsor, Moroccan Oil. That's not very apolitical, is it? It is absolute insanity to have a major sponsor from a controversial country that is currently engaged in a genocide and has a long history of applying political pressure to anyone and anything that dares question or oppose its politics. It is a massive conflict of interest that undermines Eurovision's supposed apolitical neutrality. And perhaps this is, at least in part, an explanation of why the EBU made the decisions it did. This is perhaps the first and biggest thing that needs to change. The EBU and Eurovision should not accept money from regimes doing genocide and silencing critics. Full stop. Furthermore, to move forward from here, there would need to be public apologies and massive internal shakeups. There would need to be public apologies to the fans who were let down, to the artists who were traumatized by the toxic environment fostered by the EBU, to Just, whose dream to participate at Eurovision for his late father was shattered, to all the voices who were silenced, and, most of all, to the Palestinian people whose lives and brutal deaths mattered so little to the organizers of Eurovision 2024. These organizers, every single person who had anything to do with the decision-making for Eurovision 2024, all of them need to resign in shame. Even then, this may be a stain on the legacy of Eurovision so repugnant that the stench of it can never be fully removed. Israel is smearing blood all over the rubble of Gaza, the blood of babies, children, women and men, innocent civilians, but also the blood of aid workers, United Nations personnel, doctors, nurses, EMTs, and more journalists than in any other conflict. The EBU's decision to let Israel come into its house and put its feet up in that nice white couch of perceived civil morality and tolerance, while drenched in all this blood, may just leave a stain so deep it can never be washed out. The EBU did release a statement that tried to address the criticisms it has received of this year's Eurovision. Let me read it in full. Quote, "We regret that some delegations at Eurovision Song Contest in Malmö didn't respect the spirit of the rules and the competition, both on-site and during their broadcasts. We spoke to a number of delegations during the event regarding various issues that were brought to our attention. The EBU's governing bodies will, together with the heads of delegations, review the events surrounding the ESC in Malmö to move forward in a positive way and to ensure the values of the event are respected by everyone. Individual cases will be discussed by the event's governing body, the Eurovision Song Contest Reference Group, made up of representatives from participating broadcasters, at its next meeting. End quote. Some delegations didn't respect the spirit of the rules and the competition. Some. Even now, the EBU is refusing to hold itself accountable. Even now, it refuses to acknowledge how poorly Israel has behaved. But above all, even now, the EBU refuses to even mention the stench of Palestinian blood it is helping Israel cover up. I'm not holding my breath for any, quote, positive way to move forward, end quote. For shame. Anyway, thanks for watching. Apologies to everyone whose names and languages I butchered. Remember to like and subscribe. If you have any thoughts, leave them below. It really helps and puts a smile on my face. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.